Hey there, YouTube. I was just telling the chat that I would have liked to see Nuremberg trial, similar Nuremberg trials for the United States war criminals, especially George Bush and Dick Cheney. But yes, I would also include Barack Obama on that list, and yes, I would include Joe Biden as well, who was eager to commit war crimes right off the bat. So, with that said, Joe Biden did get us out of Afghanistan, even though he did an absolute terrible job doing it. All right, let's get into it.
This week marks 20 years since the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. And at the time, Washington and Britain said the invasion was necessary because Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein planned imminent use of weapons of mass destruction. But that allegation proved to be false. After the regime was toppled, loyalists began an insurgency which led to a civil war and later the rise of ISIS. The exact death toll of Iraqis is unknown, but well over 1 million people are believed to have died since 2003, and Iraq has still not fully recovered. Earlier today, right here on CBC News Network on Rosemary Barton Live, we heard from former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien on his decision to leave Canada out of the war in Iraq.
But, you know, it was a great indication that we were...
I watched this whole interview, and he said nothing of substance, I gotta say.
A very independent nation, that we were not the 51st state of America that too often some people think we were. And but I made a decision not for that. I made a decision because I thought that it was a big error to go to war in Iraq because there was no proof of weapon of mass destruction.
Yeah. All right. And, okay, I take that back. That is the big point that he was hounding on. The reason why he made the decision is that they took an unbiased look, I guess a less biased look. It's hard to say for a country to be unbiased, but they took a less biased look at the totality of the information, and they were just like, there's just not enough evidence to support this claim that there's weapons of mass destruction. You know, we're not as impressed with Colin Powell as they are in the U.S. and the U.K. And they decided not to go in, and they were 100% correct.
Despite of the pressure from George W. and Tony Blair and the business community and so on, we decided that it was to be no. And I made that statement 20 years ago today.
Well, thank you very much for that, Mary. I'm going to go ahead and put that in our documentary section on the Discord.
That was former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien speaking earlier today on Rosemary Barton Live. Now I want to speak more about this anniversary, and we're joined by Nadia Al-Ali. She's director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown University, and she's joining us from Providence, Rhode Island. Thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for inviting me, Chris.
I want to start by asking you, as someone of Iraqi heritage, how are you processing this anniversary?
Well, I feel quite ambivalent about it because Iraq has been forgotten, has been out of media interest for the at least past 10 years. And so in some ways, I'm a little bit suspicious of the sudden interest. But on the other hand, you know, I'm glad that people start to remember one of the crimes of the centuries, I would say, the invasion, which was a grave error. You know, not only because of the weapons of mass destruction, but it's impossible to bring democracy and human rights to a country through a military invasion. But despite that, you know, the false premise, but also say that, you know, many Iraqis were actually glad to see Saddam Hussein gone.
Welcome
of
back,
course,
Lenny.
it was a terrible dictator, and the combination of sanctions
She's making
and
an interesting
Saddam Hussein
point.
made life in Iraq unbearable. But the problem wasn't only the invasion, but it was also the aftermath of the invasion and all the decisions that were made by the US-led invasion, which led, as you already pointed out, to sectarian divisions, to chaos, lawlessness. And I have particularly been concerned about the specific effects of the invasion occupation on women in Iraq,
Lenny,
who to my mind have been the biggest losers, despite this rhetoric of liberating Iraqi women.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the first thing that you said
exactly
there, that Iraq has not been in the headlines in all these 20 years. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that's unfortunately how the media works. I mean, there are so many other wars, of course. There has been Syria, there has been the so-called Arab Spring and Afghanistan. But those of us who are following closely events in Iraq, I mean, there has been ongoing violence. There has also been protest movements against the government. We have come full circle because the current government is, again, authoritarian, is corrupt. But there is a new generation of Iraqis who are trying to really think of a different way of envisioning the country in a way that is not divided
It
along
was always up to the Iraqi citizens, and so this solution is going to need to come from them.
sectarian lines, and that is not governed by an authoritarian elite.
Now, the U.S. and the U.K. had called this Operation Iraqi Freedom, and we know that presidents from both of those countries had also said that this was all about democracy and liberating women. You already mentioned that you felt like women have been among the biggest losers since all of this.
Absolutely.
Can you expand how, as people look back on the war, how they're feeling about how it all started?
Well, I mean, despite the fact that Iraq was governed by a dictatorship, I mean, women in Iraq were amongst the most educated in the region. They were part of the labor force. They were pretty much able to move about freely. And in the aftermath of the invasion, you had this mushrooming of gender-based violence. You had a militia who were trying to control women's dress codes, women's mobility. And you had a occupying force who could care less. I mean, women's rights were the first, actually, point that dropped off everyone's agenda. And many...
We weren't there for democracy, okay? We weren't there for human rights. We were there for a myriad of political and other horrible reasons. None of them had to do with protecting people.
Parents, especially during the height of the sectarian violence, felt unable to send their girls or daughters to school or to university because they were just too worried about them. I mean, now the situation has shifted. I mean, after 20 years, I think it's important to not only paint a grim picture. I mean, Iraq has come a long way, but the country is still very far from having recovered, and especially when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to employment, when it comes to a general sense of security, there is still there's still a long way to go.
Why do you think that shift has happened?
Which shift?
The shift to having kind of a better scenario, a better situation you mentioned there just at the end. Why do you think that's taken place?
Well, it is, a young generation of Iraqis who are just fed up with war and violence. And, they didn't grow up during the Ba'ath regime. And they have been protesting on the street.
Yeah, and this is where technology comes in, because it's just you get a window into the world way more than TV or movies. You get a window into the world, and you see that people are living peacefully everywhere, and you start to wonder, why can't I have this too? Why can't we just be sane? It's not about emulating Western values. It's just about wanting peace and security, and then seeing that it can be a reality with other systems and other philosophies. And I'm not talking about religion here specifically. I'm just talking about, the idea of democracy, right, is often vilified in a lot of these places. And no, authoritarian theocracy is the only way to go. And, and sometimes that's, that's all they have to choose from, right? The two opposing parties are like, oppress people, or oppress people a little bit less, but still pretty hard oppression under the guise of religion. Like it. It's this is where technology allows you to see that there's a better world outside of those two extremes.
They haven't achieved their goals yet, but I feel that there is this push. When it comes to the government, we have not reached a better scenario yet. The government is still in shambles. The government is still sectarian. It is corrupt. Yeah. It is incompetent.
That's where these people come in.
But the hope comes from the youth in Iraq,
absolutely, Zia.
Who
absolutely.
20 years on really want to see a different Iraq. They want to have a life that is not governed by violence, insecurity, and also sectarianism.
It's so important to learn from the past and to learn from history to make sure that problematic decisions are not repeated. If you were able to speak with the U.S. administration and...
When did Leave It to Beaver start covering news? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Governments like Canada, what would you want to tell them about what things you think they should have learned from all of
This
this?
is Wally Beaver.
Well, the first lesson is that you cannot bring democracy and human rights through a military invasion that is opposed by a large part of the population. Secondly,
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
listen to people who actually have an insight into the country, because, as I said, even in the aftermath of the invasion, things didn't have to go as badly as they went. If the administration would have listened to experts who
if the administration was interested in more than just revenge, they could have actually spent a lot of money and done a lot of good for the Iraqi people. Yeah, no doubt about it. Maybe use a little bit of that military might to try and secure some, political peace and, but no, we just fuck America, fuck yeah. Like we literally went in there just rootin', tootin', shooting, and didn't get a goddamn thing done. We got a lot of people fucking killed is what happened.
would have given advice against the disbanding of the army, against dividing up Iraq along sectarian lines, against the depacification in a way that actually alienated a large part of the population. So, there are people who would have helped to advise. But the first lesson, I think, is that, democracy and human rights, as we also saw in the case of Afghanistan, is not achieved through a military invasion.
No. Well,
All right, Nadia. Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today. I appreciate it.
I've explained this before, and I'll go ahead and explain it again for anybody that's new to the stream. But the military-industrial complex was given a gift with the Ukraine situation. For the first time in my entire life, there's a legitimate military solution to a political problem, right? A political problem that turned into a military problem. Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, there was no military solution to fix what the issue was. Like, because what was the issue in Vietnam? Communism, right? Is that an issue that needs to be fixed, first of all, right? If a country wants to be communist, that should be their business. But there was never a political solution for Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam. There is a political solution for Ukraine. A lot of lefties have a really hard time wrapping their fucking noodle around that reality. But it's true. Yeah, Raytheon stocks through the roof. Military industrial complex is like, what? What do you mean embarrass Russia more than they've ever been embarrassed since the separation of the Soviet Union at a discount price and not lose, a single American soldier. Of course, we've already lost some Americans in Ukraine, but no official boots on the ground. Do it, discount war. Don't have to send in your troops. You get to use it as a political boon. Western Alliance is happy that they're separating from Russian oil. Putin's a fool. Putin is a political fool. Putin is honestly an absolute fool. Anyway, that's my Iraq news. We're getting close to Ukraine. Ukraine just spills into every single conversation, it seems. But that's just how it is. All right, moving on.